We're excited to have our viewers join us for the first panel of our track titled FDA, A View from the Inside. We have three very experienced senior officials from the FDA, one from each center, with us today to share their thoughts from the inside on FDA's role in regulating our industry and supporting innovation. I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Jacqueline Corrigan-Curay, followed by Dr. Doug Kelly and Dr. Celia Witten.
So good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jacqueline Corrigan-Curay. I'm also the Principal Deputy Center Director of CDER. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
Hi, I'm Doug Kelly, and unlike what Chris just said, I'm the least experienced here. I was for 30 years was a early stage venture capitalist in Palo Alto, California, with the Alloy Ventures asset management family of companies, and taken a couple dozen products through the FDA. And Jeff Shuren asked me to be his number two right as COVID started taking off, and I've been here since last August, or over a little over a year, 14, 15 months. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm Celia Witten. I'm the Deputy Director of CBER, which is the Center for Biologics at FDA, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Now, I'll ask each of you to take a few minutes to give us your perspective from your vantage point of the FDA, starting with Dr. Jacqueline Corrigan-Curay.
Great. Let me pull up some slides and we'll get started. Okay. So thank you again for having me here. Just briefly, I've just copied, CDER's mission statement, and I'm really going to just say a couple of words. We're really at the intersection of innovation, bringing new drugs that are safe and effective for their intended use, and then ensuring that there's access to these drugs, and overall making sure that quality is always at the center of that. So I'd like to touch on, in terms of our priorities, is COVID-19, opioids, evidence generation, meeting unmet medical needs, and a little bit on our User Fee Amendments Act and reauthorization. So of course, as you know, we still are in the midst of COVID. Hopefully we'll be moving through this pandemic soon. But as many of you may already be aware, at the beginning of the pandemic, we set up the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program to try and really move quickly to get development programs and work with sponsors. And out of this, we do have one approved treatment, 11 treatments under emergency use, and we'll be hearing about the Merck oral antiviral later this month at an advisory committee meeting. But of course, you can see tremendous work in terms of how many development programs and trials, as well as expanded access for patients. Now, besides therapeutic development, which of course is front and foremost, it's really been an all hands on deck. Another key aspect of the pandemic was keeping medications that hospitals needed available to them, and that included working with our generic manufacturers in terms of new supplements to increase manufacturing, change sites, even new ANDAs that came onto the market, as well as using regulatory flexibility when appropriate, including compounding and repackaging. We also went after fraud on the internet and other fraudulent promotion of supposed COVID cures, and continue to our work on surveillance and epidemiology, looking at all these products as they enter the market under the EUAs, as well as responding to the public over 23,000 requests. One thing that was really brought to the forefront, I think, during the pandemic was, before we've always had a drug shortage program in which we work with manufacturers. A lot of drug shortages are caused by disruptions in the manufacturing or quality issues. But what we really saw was such a dynamic demand for different drugs during the pandemic that we realized we really need to set up more of a drug supply chain signal detection, and we've been working with that, and that's really bringing all the data that we have to bear in a very linked and integrated way, and trying to overlay some analytics so we can really be proactive to mitigate and manage shortages and increases in demand. And indeed, that has been a priority of the administration. Many of you may be aware that one of the first executive orders for the administration was building resilient supply chains, and FDA worked with HHS to draft the pharmaceutical and API part of that report. And there were sort of 4 pillars identified that would really help bring a robust and resilient supply chain. And that was boosting local production and fostering international cooperation. Obviously, we won't produce everything here ourselves. Promoting research and development that establishes innovative manufacturing processes and production technologies to strengthen supply chain resilience. And that's something that FDA has been working on. We've been funding research in advanced manufacturing. We have an advanced technology team for manufacturers to meet with if they have new technologies. And that will really feed into boosting local production by using technology to make production more economically competitive. And then thinking about quality management maturity and sort of creating that robust management maturity to ensure consistent and reliable drug manufacturing. And finally, the importance of leveraging data to improve supply chain resilience through transparency, something that we are also working on. I just want to talk a little bit about quality. As many of you know, it doesn't matter where you produce your drug, you're also subject to the same quality standards of FDA. And of course, under COVID, we had some real challenges in traveling and doing inspections. However, we did continue to do mission critical inspections, and the guidance really gives an idea of what those are. And when appropriate, we've also implemented facility evaluations using alternative approaches, be that, requesting existing inspection information from other trusted foreign regulatory partners. But I also like to point out performing remote interactive evaluation. So using technology to be there and see the production live. And at the bottom, I just have statistics from the first year of our work in this area to say that, really touched on a number of ANDAs are generics, our NDAs are our new small molecules, and our biologics are our BLAs. And by using these alternative approaches, we were able to complete facility assessments by reducing the need to conduct in-person pre-approval inspections about 50% of the time. So we will continue to learn from these lessons on facility inspections, facility assessments that we've done during COVID. I want to move to opioids because although COVID has, of course, dominated everything in 2021, we have never taken our eyes off the opioid epidemic, which unfortunately has really worsened during the pandemic in terms of overdose deaths. We've taken a number of actions. I just highlighted some here and included a website for you to look at, but certainly updating pilot programs so that we can help reduce the availability of unapproved opioids that are illegally offered for sale online, warning letters for manufacturers that promote their opioids inappropriately, the first abuse deterrent generic, so providing a lower cost alternative for there, a number of public meetings, including things on morphine milligram equivalents, but also looking at other drugs like benzodiazepines. And then we approved a higher dose naloxone hydrochloride nasal spray. And this is just a sample of some of the activities that we've engaged in. Some of you may know that HHS recently released their strategy, which includes primary prevention, evidence-based treatment, harm reduction, recovery support. There's a URL to get more information. And FDA will continue in CDER in particular to support that through a number of different areas. In the primary prevention, reducing clinically inappropriate prescribing of medications with abuse or misuse potential. We recently held a meeting even talking about mandatory opioid prescriber education, advancing innovative opioid packaging solutions, as well as we talked about the benzodiazepine prescriptions, and then supporting development of evidence-based non-opioid treatments to effectively manage pain. We also want to support development and widen availability of opioid overdose reversal agents, and also advance home opioid disposal solutions so we prevent diversion. And finally, we need to support research on and development of new substance use disorder treatments. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to promoting innovation evidence generation. One thing that COVID did was really advance new trial conduct by really promoting decentralized trials and the use of digital health technologies to gather data. And certainly we will continue to promote those through guidance on decentralized trials and digital health tools. Also real evidence on real world evidence and using that to understand the pandemic. And we've started to issue what will be a series of guidance on real world data in support of our real world evidence in support of our RealWorld Evidence Program. The first one is listed there on the right. I would also note that in the past year, we've actually approved the first new use of a transplant drug based solely on real-world evidence. So these are high priorities for us. And they join some of our other priorities in terms of complex innovative trial designs, a pilot program that continues, in which we look to foster complex innovative designs in late-stage drug development, such as adaptive trial designs. We also wrote about guidance on master protocols for COVID-19, something that we've seen really much more in the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, there's continued interest in model-informed drug development, using that knowledge we have about the drug, a disease, and how it affects, and mathematical modeling to address issues pertaining to drug development or clinical use. So certainly these are all areas of priority for us moving forward. Finally, I want to talk about we need to always make sure we're meeting unmet medical needs. Our areas of focus include rare diseases and neurodegenerative diseases, infectious, emerging, and neglected diseases. Access to biosimilars, we've had a very successful generic program, and generic drugs really account for 90% of prescriptions, but we want to increase access to biosimilars as well as increasing diversity in clinical trials. So just a couple of stats, we are doing well in the rare disease, but there's thousands of rare diseases, but 58% of our approvals in CDER in 2020 were for rare diseases, with 31 with orphan designation. And a number of them used one or more of our expedited programs, which we know accelerate the time from development to marketing. These are just some of the examples of the diseases that we have new orphan treatments for in 2021, including the indication to lung transplant. We were also engaged in an orphan drug technology modernization effort for the orphan drug designations. We started CDER's Rare Disease Development Council to really bring together all our scientific experts working on rare diseases to share best practices and to really learn from each other. And then finally, we continue to support the Rare Disease Cure Accelerator, which is part of our Critical Path initiative. And it's a data and analytics platform to really maximize the data that we're getting from clinical trials as well as real world data. Another area is infectious diseases, and although again COVID dominated, in 2021 we continue to have approval for sort of neglected tropical diseases, including African trypanosomiasis, Ebola virus, multi-drug resistant HIV. Most people think of HIV as a chronic, but there are still these unmet needs in HIV and Chagas disease. Finally, talking about biosimilars, again, it's very important for us to increase competition in this market. Since the launch of the biologics price competition, there are now 31 approved products, including 2 interchangeables for 11 reference products. Some of you may know that insulin and certain other biologic drugs transitioned to a different regulatory pathway in March 2020, and we are very pleased to have the first interchangeable biosimilar insulin product, Semglee, approved in July of 2021. I'd just like to talk, obviously, COVID brought into relief, the disproportionate impact that certain diseases can have on different racial and ethnic groups. This is just showing hospitalization rates per 100,000 by different ethnic groups. And CDER is really, I think, like all of FDA, really committed to increasing clinical trial diversity. This is from our Office of Minority Health and Health Equity. We have a number of programs and outreach in this area, and during the November 2020, we issued our final guidance on enhancing diversity in clinical trial populations. Finally, I just want to touch on our UFAs. User fee accounts for 70% of CDER's annual budget, and the current 5-year authorization for PDUFA, GDUFA, and BsUFA. These are our prescription, our generics, and our biosimilars run through the end of fiscal year 22. We have engaged in reauthorization activities, and actually the draft commitment letters are now published on our website. There's some URLs at the bottom to get more information. Public meetings for the PDUFA and BsUFA have occurred. That's where the draft commitment letters are discussed, and there's opportunity for comment. Please join us if you're interested for the GDUFA public meeting next week on the 16th. FDA will then deliver these proposed packages to Congress in January 22, and we're also working on our new UFA program, implementation of OTC monograph user fee acts. I don't have time to go through some of the highlights, but again, the commitment letters are there for you to read on our website. So just looking forward, we have continued to acquire talent during the pandemic. Attrition had been lower. The success of large platform trials and use of clinical networks that we've seen during the pandemic, I think, will shape future research. We've all become much more familiar with video interaction and other interactive technology, and I think that will not only change the way we work, but change the way we do clinical trials. And so we have gained experience in the use of these decentralized platforms. The importance of enrolling a diverse clinical population, understanding the barriers to achieving that goal remains front and center. And we have expanded our tools to evaluate manufacturing facilities and investigative sites. And real-world evidence has played a central role in understanding COVID-19, generating hypotheses, and in safety monitoring, and will continue to explore its use in other areas. And with that, I'd like to just close and say thank you to the CDER team.
Thank you, Dr. Corrigan-Curay. We'll now hear from Dr. Kelly.
So I got a lot of slides. Don't freak out. It's I'm just going to whip through most of them. I'm going to go through a little bit about what happened at CDRH during COVID, but mostly kind of looking forward to what we're planning on doing. COVID was a real shock to the system for the device and diagnostics branch at FDA. Learned a lot of lessons from it, and I'm going to talk about a bunch of those. We have the critical number here is that we had almost 400,000 inbounds to the agency, to the device branch, which is a tiny branch. And this was just not, we just could not do the old way of doing things and respond to this many inbounds. So we shifted around a lot, but mostly we did a couple things. One of them is that we decided to get much more interactive and informal from our normal formalized processes. It really, that kind of communication and how we interact with companies completely changed how we dealt with industry over COVID-19, and was really a model for looking forward. Here's some other slides. 21,000 plus pre-market submissions in 2020. It's a crazy number. And so what we really learned was that there's huge value in regulatory flexibility and in really engaging with sponsors for their devices and diagnostics. The number keeps going up about new devices, and that's a good thing. It means that innovation is not dead. And it looks for a breakthrough like this year will be another record number, will be probably over 200. And in spite of all this stuff going on, we still have really good ratings from people in terms of customer service. And our model for customer service is not really the government; it's Amazon or Zappos. That's when you're really getting good customer service, is when you're comparing yourself to the best in the business. And we're committed to doing that. So I'm going to talk about MDUFA and are thinking about it in the centerpiece of the MDUFA Act, which is called the TAP program, which I'll get into in a second. So this is the typical McKinsey chevronogram of what we call the total product life cycle from idea to adoption, where you go through the FDA, you get your decision, then you're talking to payers and getting a code if you don't have one, and coverage, and then ultimately widespread adoption and reimbursement. The key to all this is that our public health mission is, if we're getting a bunch of stuff approved, but it doesn't make it all the way to patient access to high quality, innovative, safe, and medical devices, we have not done our public health mission. This is typically what happens, and anybody who's been in the medical device business, as I've been, knows this is typically how it goes. Your idea comes from typically a geek or a doc who has an interesting idea. Most of the people who come to FDA have never been through the FDA before. They hire a bunch of consultants who, unfortunately, they typically tell them, get me through the FDA without a clinical trial, and you have to. I want the cheapest trial I can do, and I want to get through as fast as possible. What happens when they do that is they're completely unprepared for dealing with all these other downstream things, and you cannot finance these. If you've spent a bunch of time through the FDA and you say, oh, great, I've got a PMA or a 510K, I just need 5 years of total all causes mortality data for payers, you cannot finance that. And so what happens is that there's a fire sale. The innovator, the founder of the company, gets branded with a big X on the middle of his forehead because he had a failure. And the investors who then got burned say, I'm never going to do another medical device deal. it resonates through the system in a way that it has completely destroyed the innovation ecosystem for medical devices and diagnostics. There are notable exceptions, but for a lot of the companies that we see, they end up failing here in this part of the curve. So patients do not get access to the devices that they should have, devices and diagnostics. And the reason for that is that there's all these stakeholders. The FDA is one of them, but there's providers, the professional society, there's payers, and there's patients, and they all have legitimate evidentiary requirements. The problem is that they typically are dealt with at the end of the process. And so as a founder, you can't tell your investors, is this going to be a 3-year process or a 13-year process? Because you don't know, you just don't know. I mean, look what happened to iRhythm. They were doing great, but then found out very late in the game after they'd gone public and everything that reimbursement was going to be terrible. And we see a lot of that. So that what it means is that instead of dealing with all this up front, people dealing on the back end, dealing with it, it's a recipe for failure. So the question is, how can we shift this late stage risk where changes are very expensive to make? You typically have a high burn rate and a lot of people on your payroll, to early stage where you may have just a few people and making big shifts in strategy is really not that big of a deal compared to later on. So, this has been really well known at AdvaMed. They've known about it from they published this report with Deloitte, and they call this the Valley of Death. And so people have talked about it a lot, but they really haven't really known what to do with it. But the practical effects of that are what you see here, which is that if you look at software as in the venture capital business, software is a $45 billion sector. It's actually it's significantly more than that. This is back in 2019. And here you see biotech, where creating $1 billion company in biotech is it's hard, but it's not as hard as doing it in medical devices. And look at and this contains medical devices here, this red line. It's way down here. And why is that? Well, because we're constrained by things that these other groups are not. Specifically, the guys in software can fail early. They can develop a minimally viable product very early on for very little amount of money. And if that grows, then they can have no problem getting financing. Biotech has access to all kinds of giant dollars. And the guys over at Arch do, $1 billion Series A. In medtech, all those early investors are gone because money is fungible. And if it looks like biotech is a better deal than medtech, that's where the money is going, or to software. And we've seen that. So the other thing that we've noticed through the COVID crisis was that our method of communication really did matter. So pre-subs have been hugely successful. Industry kind of discounted that this was going to be very interesting, but we have more demand than we can handle for pre-subs. Breakthroughs have gone through the roof, and we just learned that we can't deal long-term with the way we've been doing things at CDRH, sustainably for the long term with the amount of inbounds that we had. So it really didn't. We have to do things in a different way. So when I came up with one of the questions asked was like, what if FDA? We're the first people that innovator comes to that ask for evidence about what they do. And we had an entrepreneur in residence who was with us for a year a while ago, a med tech guy, who said, the dirty secret in regulatory is that regulatory and the FDA is the best thing that's ever happened to medical devices, because for the first time, the companies that really had the wherewithal and the scientific expertise and the devices were really worth anything got to prove it and had an official government stamp that, yes, we agree with you, this is a great thing. Whereas before FDA, all kinds of crazy stuff made in the market. Peter Hutt, who wrote a lot of the original food and drug law, had a great little anecdote in his book, and his fundamental book about food and drug law, talking about how Mesmer and mesmerizing was the first medical device. It was a box that you could lay down in like a coffin, and he said that you could essentially be hypnotized when you lay down in this box. And it turns out, well, guess what? It didn't work, and people started complaining because they were really expensive, and that led to a bunch of food and drug law, and it has continued to date. So what we're proposing is that we pull together all of these stakeholder groups, patients and providers and payers, using a functionality we call TAP, or the Total Product Lifecycle TPL Advisory Program, which is essentially a contractor or a Sherpa or a consultant within FDA. And their job is to help you talk to these people. It's completely voluntary. And although initially we're going to start it with just with breakthrough and a couple of smaller segments, but basically if you agree, then we will introduce you to a patient forum where patients can comment on your product features and your endpoints in your study and talk about risk benefit in a quantitative way. Providers can tell you exactly what they need to see to maybe provide evidence for coding, and payers can talk about the kind of durability study that they need to see. And they can talk to you about this all up front instead of waiting to the end where everybody kind of hopes that, gee, I hope it's not too bad. It's much better to have, I mean, perfect information is infinitely expensive. But this, I think, goes a long way to solving the problem of risk in medtech development, bringing all these people together early on. And I guess another way of looking at it is that instead of dealing with it all the way back here, we deal with it early on, combined with a new methodology for communicating with people, where we provision our review groups with enough new reviewers under our proposal so that they have bandwidth to give instantaneous results, not results 30 days from now, 60 days from now, after a pre-sub. I'm going to show you another example here. The idea being that instead of doing this, we have your FDA study, and then later on you do a payer study. You do what I've done personally, which is maybe you could do a combined study where you start with your FDA study and then you roll it over into a durability study. And it turns out when you do this, then you can pick off payers as the data rolls in. If they want to see 5 years, 7 years, 20 years, whatever it is. But you found out about that here and not here. Because again, if you go to payers and they say, I need a 20-year all-causes mortality randomized controlled study, and you can just say, I can't finance that, that gives you a chance to, instead of focusing on that problem, find another problem where the payers maybe not so demanding. And this scratches a lot of itch for everybody. So the TAP advisors, what they do that doesn't happen now is that they're kind of your hands-on guide through the FDA. They say, and we came up with this idea when there's a guy in the cardiovascular division, a guy named Andy Farb, a cardiologist, who basically would say, hey, when you bring your stuff in, you have to have this particular thing formatted in this way because Betty's going to see it, and Betty hates it when it's done this way, and she's just going to reject it. And then you're going to go to Bob, and you want to talk to Bob. If you don't include this data for Bob, Bob's going to bounce you right out. So the idea is that this TAP advisor is somebody who kind of has a deep institutional knowledge and can tell you, where you have to go, what you need to do with what data formatted in which way, to try to greatly lower the number of applications that are rejected out of hand. But usually not until very late. And meanwhile, you've gone through months of burn. And if these late rejections with FDA, when it happens, it may mean for you another financing, which is terrible. It's also the TAP advisory program is a resource for convening other stakeholders that we have, including things like hospital purchasing managers. I mean, we'll start it small, but we will grow it. And again, a coordinator, again, when you have a contractor building a house for you, the great thing a contractor does is he makes sure the tile guy and the drywall guy shows up after and not before the electrician and the plumber. So part of it's coordinating all this stuff. And part of what we want to do in a strategic proposal I have called radical transparency is we will create a guide for you to show exactly who you're talking to, when you're talking to them, and what data they need to see to move on to the next thing. So instead of being constantly reactive to what's coming from FDA, you're being proactive. You know what's coming. You know you have to start your sterility testing here, and if you wait, it's going to push you back. And ultimately, I was talking to Kevin Lobo right after I started FDA. He said, the number 2 cause of rejecting an M&A proposal from a company is quality. Number 1 is price, of course, but number 2 is quality. And so helping companies really understand how their quality system resonates through the entire organization and through their application is really, really important. That's something a TAP advisor can help do. So who's TAP for? Like I said, it's for, initially it's going to be for breakthrough programs, and then our safer technologies program, STEP, which are devices that are significantly safer, but of equivalent efficacy. And then other devices with public health importance, things like pediatric surgical tools, things like that. So the other thing I want to talk about was the communication. And so this is a typical communication with an FDA, right? You do a pre-sub, then there's a long pause, and the pre-sub is a very formal communication. It's an hour-long meeting. You're only allowed to ask certain things. How you record things it's very formalized. And then there's this long pause. And then if you have another one, then you do a second one. And if it's been too long, then they have to take even longer time because the people need to refresh themselves about what they're doing. As opposed to something like this, where then this conversation up here on top, this is exactly like a long distance relationship, which is why they're so dysfunctional, right? Because you don't talk all the time, as opposed to here where the threshold is much lower, it's much more informal, and you talk back and forth all the time. That way, if the FDA says something and then they consult further and they have to walk it back, they're walking back days of conversation and not 6 months of conversation where you may have made a $30 million decision that becomes irrelevant. So the idea here is to just increase this dialogue, decrease the formality and the threshold for people to talk. With the goal being at the end of the day, to reduce risk and help us get to this point again where patients have access to high quality, innovation, safe, and effective medical devices. But more than that, the better part of this is that because you've had to incorporate the evidence of all these other downstream players early on, not for the FDA, but for you, and that's in the industry, they call that marketing. We call it public health, but you have a much better characterized device. It's better for everybody. It's safer. It's been pulled back and forth through the knothole a bunch more times. It's a much better way to run CDRH, and so that's the centerpiece of our proposal. And with that, logo, and then I'm done.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly. We will also now hear from Dr. Whitten.
Thanks again for inviting me to speak. I'm going to give an update. Next slide. And I'm going to cover, these are just selected CBER priorities that I'm going to talk about, as well as some lessons learned from the pandemic, specifically in the Office of Cell Tissue and Gene Therapy, but they echo some of the things that Jacqueline talked about during her talk. Okay, next slide. So just before I start talking about our priorities, I just want to, for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with which products are regulated where, just show this slide, which gives you an idea of what are the products that are regulated in CBER. And the three areas that I'm going to talk about specifically during this talk today are going to be preventative vaccines, cell and gene therapies, and blood components. Next slide. So my first topic is going to be about expediting the development and availability of COVID-19 vaccines. And I'm sure that it's obviously, this has been a very high priority for FDA. I probably don't need to tell this audience what a truly remarkable achievement it is that vaccines were developed and available so quickly. Many groups of scientists, regulators, patients who participated in trials, all deserve credit for this. So I think it'd be hard to talk about everything that went into this rather large achievement, but I'm going to talk about a couple of the steps that were taken to facilitate development that involved FDA. Next slide. So this slide shows traditional vaccine development, and everything happens in sequence. Next slide. But in contrast, in this slide, there's a number of things that are proceeding in parallel, in particular, large clinical trials and manufacturing scale up. And the scale up of production of vaccine at risk is something that manufacturers don't generally do because it is at risk. But in this case, the idea was to have the vaccine ready if the clinical trials performed in support of the vaccines were positive. And I would say this was a huge critical factor in availability of vaccines at such an early time point in the pandemic. An additional factor was the use of the emergency use authorization pathway. And this is something that was developed in the wake of the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And you can see that it did enable licensure sooner than emergency use authorization earlier than licensure to make the vaccines available. Next slide. So another thing that I want to point to was when the pandemic hit, I mean, really, I think like everywhere, it took us a while to figure out, what were even going to be the issues for us. But one thing that was clear was that manufacturers wanted a guidepost about, or information about what the goals were. What were the development goals in terms of what were the endpoints, how many patients, and the duration of the trials and the size of the safety database. And at the time of COVID, this was along the lines of the other efforts that Jacqueline talked about in her talk. There was an effort FDA-wide to streamline the development of guidance documents for COVID-19. So these two guidance documents were developed as part of that streamlined process. And I think that the clear goals that they laid out in terms of what what those key parameters in clinical trials needed to be, and they also provide information about manufacturing and preclinical development also. Those were also critical to the rapid development of the COVID vaccine. So those are the two things I think were far and away from FDA point of view, some of the most critical. Next slide. So I'm going to move on to another priority, which is to initiate implementation of the Bespoke gene therapy program. And I'll just say that the field of gene therapy has exploded in the last few years and is an important potential tool in treating rare diseases. Many genetic diseases could be theoretically treated by targeted correction or replacement of a faulty gene. Some of these diseases affect relatively few patients. So I'm going to talk about a recent partnership developed in conjunction with NIH and the Foundation for NIH to foster development of gene therapies intended to treat rare diseases that may affect populations too small for viable commercial development at this time. But before I talk about that specific program, I want to mention one of the recent gene therapies that really has set off a flurry of optimism, interest, and enthusiasm. Next slide. So this approval, which was in 2018, was an approval of a product for treatment of patients less than 2 years of age with spinal muscular atrophy type 1. Zolgensma is an AAV vector-based gene therapy. And I think this approval, the field was already growing, but this approval really electrified the field, I think. Next slide. So the infantile SMA is the most severe and most common form. These children have problems with motor function, trouble holding their head up, sucking and breathing. These problems can be present at birth or by age 6 months, and most of these don't survive past early childhood. This slide shows the scores of patients in the trial on a scale for neuromuscular disorders. And you can see the remarkable benefit of this in this study. So the question is, how can we best marshal our collective resources to provide this kind of benefit or try to provide this kind of benefit for other small populations, many even smaller than this disease? Next slide. So I have one, the next slide is about that effort, but I just inserted this slide just to give you the idea of the rapid growth in cell and gene therapy. Many of these, I'd say the vast majority of these, are aimed at rare diseases. So you can see that the number of cell and gene therapy INDs is really pretty much doubled in the last 4 years. Next slide. So it's important to develop therapies for disorders that are very rare. And I think it is not just for the rare diseases that might benefit, but it's quite possible that the more we learn to address molecular defects, the more it may become the case that common diseases are reduced to rare diseases that can also be treated in one of these ways. Next slide. So the partnership I've been talking about is called the ampbgtc, or Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium. And because of the possibilities of benefit and the need to foster development, NCATS at NIH, the Foundation for NIH, and CBER led the development of this consortium. There are a number of partners which are listed generally here, and the goal of this effort is to make AAV technology more accessible to a broader range of diseases and accelerate or streamline preclinical and product testing and to facilitate scientific and regulatory advances that'll benefit the entire field, which may make it more attractive for companies to invest in rare diseases and bring gene therapies to people sooner. So to begin with, the consortium will aim to develop a standard set of analytic testing and other protocols, which will be shared, and then there'll be feedback during the development, which will be part of the process. And I've included a link to find more information. Next slide. The next two topics are about blood research. And so I'll just say, the first one is about blood donation policies. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So we have to do two things with blood safety. And one is to always be on the alert for epidemiology of new diseases that may pose a threat to the blood supply. But the examples I'm going to give here are about diseases in which we're trying to reevaluate what we do, which we also have to constantly do so that we can decrease our reliance on testing when it's not needed. So this one is an example. In 2016, we determined Zika virus was a relevant transfusion transmitted infection, and blood centers were required to take appropriate measures. However, because the epidemiology of this disease has declined in this country and worldwide, really, we've issued guidance discontinuing testing for Zika virus. So this is the way that we look at diseases. You have to reevaluate it each time, whether we need to continue testing and screening or whether we can modify what we're doing. Next slide. So the next slide is an example of what we're doing in the blood safety area in terms of blood safety for MSM deferral policies. So in 2015, FDA changed the indefinite deferral policies for men who have sex with men, or MSM, from an indefinite deferral to a 12-month deferral. And there were many scientific advances and public discussion that led to this change. And what I have here on this slide is the logo for the ADVANCE study, which is a collaboration between FDA and a number of partner organizations, including blood centers and healthcare centers, to conduct an initial assessment of the discrimination and function of revised donor history questions for predicting recent infection with HIV in MSM who wish to donate blood. In other words, to conduct an initial assessment of whether a donor history questionnaire based on individual risk could be as effective as time-based deferral in protecting the blood supply. Next slide. But the last initiative I want to talk about is just about advancing blood component pathogen reduction research. And so one way to keep the blood supply safe is screening and testing, but people are working on developing ways to reduce pathogens in the blood supply, and that would be, for example, very beneficial if you have a new pathogen which has not come to attention yet for screening for blood safety. Next slide. So current pathogen reduction technologies are mostly designed to target nucleic acids, and success to date has been with specific components rather than whole blood. Next slide. So FDA is taking a number of efforts to try to expand support of pathogen reduction, both in terms of internal research, optimizing existing technologies, outside scientific contracts and grants, and to address these areas, optimizing existing technologies, new technologies, and also characterizing product quality. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about lessons learned from the pandemic. Obviously, we've learned quite a bit. Next slide. But one thing I've already mentioned was that we have learned about the benefit of being able to, can you go to the next slide? The benefit of being able to communicate early with stakeholders in the face of the pandemic. And I have a couple guidance documents listed here, which I'll just talk about briefly. This is my last slide. The first one is an FDA guidance for medical products as a whole. It's a guidance on conduct of clinical trials. That's been particularly important to us in the cell and gene therapy area because we have had many, many questions about ongoing and proposed trials. Would patients and staff be put at risk for COVID-19 by traveling to the site? Many of these patients, because these are small diseases, may live quite far and travel quite some distance. So aside from, in addition to the usual concerns at the site itself, is the concern about travel. Clinical trials are expensive to conduct, especially labor intensive for these rare diseases, but if they're prolonged, that's even more of a concern. And so questions came up like, can expenses and travel be reduced by the use of telemedicine? Could recruitment and enrollment be handled remotely? What about informed consent? And I think the guidance was extremely helpful in addressing some of these kinds of questions and others. But I will say that the experiences also really told us that these tools about remote monitoring and telemedicine and decentralized trials can be very valuable, especially with some of our products. So I think we'll look forward to continuing to work on accelerating the use of those tools. The second guidance is a guidance about manufacturing considerations for cell and gene therapy products, because there were concerns, especially related to source material that we received during the pandemic. So I just will say these guidance documents are listed at this link. And I think one of the lessons we learned or relearned, because I think we've always known how valuable guidance documents are, but the fact that we were able to get them out in an accelerated way has really helped our response to the pandemic. So that's really all I had to say, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whitten. Thank you, panelists. It's helpful to see these things from where you sit. Now let's facilitate a bit of discussion. I have a few questions that we've been able to gather. Again, members of the audience, please submit your questions through Whova. We can look at them there and curate them for our panelists. I'm going to go ahead and start with a question for all the panel. First, what's the most important thing that industry needs to understand about interacting with FDA in the COVID era and the post-COVID era? Anyone want to volunteer?
Well, I mean, so, let's talk a little bit about the therapeutics and CTAP. In the COVID era, obviously, we had set up a whole new infrastructure to really rapidly, address the amazing increase in work. I know, Doug, you talked about what you were facing, but for us to get all these INDs and all these protocols into just a couple of divisions. And certainly, that was very successful. I'm not sure that model can be replicated after COVID for every single disease area, just because I think there's already most of those folks are working around the clock in those divisions. Nonetheless, I think, things that, and of course, the other thing is, of course, some in-person meetings have been more difficult, although, we've also dealt much more with technology, right? And being able to hold meetings through technology. And so, you could think about, will that open up more opportunities for communication or make communication more efficient when you don't need to travel necessarily for those kind of in-person meetings. And I would say, we'll also be looking at what we learned during COVID and what you can take forward. I think we want to take lessons learned. We've learned a lot about other sort of, basket trials and master protocols and things like that. So there's going to be some things that we can think about.
Yeah, I would say that what you can, one of the things that we learned again at CDRH was that this low threshold to communication, this much more informal communication, is actually much more efficient for everybody. It allows you to better hone a strategic decision that's important to you and to your investors, and to get the product where it needs to go. but I would say the number one thing, and it's always been this way, is you got to be open and honest. There are too many people who come to the FDA, and I've seen this myself back in my venture capital career when somebody would come and tell you what they had, and you'd say, "Do you have patents?" And they go, "Well, I can't show you my patents." And then it's kind of like the little prince getting the fox to come out, talk to him. It's just like little by little they showed away. It's just you just don't have time. So what's much better is just to be really open. If there's issues that you're worried about, just be open about it. We're going to find out about it anyway. You should talk. And if we find out late that there was something amiss, it's really going to damage your relationship with the agency. So I would just say consider being very open kimono and honest, and those kinds of relationships. If you talk to people who've spent a bunch of time working with our best reviewers, those relationships are like like any business relationship or a family member. It's given with a lot of honesty and openness, and you get that back from the FDA. Whereas if it tends to be much more combative and secretive and what have you, that's a different kind of relationship. And you have to ask in your business relationships that you have with other people, what are the kind of relationships you want to have? You don't want to have the super secretive, have to pull everything out of everybody with a pair of pliers. It's you'd much rather just have it be open and honest.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say that during COVID, before COVID, we have a lot of small sponsors, and one message that I think was true, has been true, is just to make sure when you're communicating or you're preparing a submission as background for discussion, just be as thorough as possible. Look back at the guidance, see what's asked for, make sure you check all those boxes. A lot of people with really good ideas don't always communicate them at their best because they don't put all the pieces together and when they send us something. So just think about the reader at the other end. If you're big companies, I don't think need that advice.
That's really good feedback. I appreciate answers from all of you. This will be really quick. Relatedly, do you believe that what we're learning as industry and as an agency from COVID, that's going to lead to greater efficiencies in the future and more innovation? Just a feel.
I think it'll accelerate some of the things that we already know that we want to do, that Jacqueline mentioned at the beginning about evidence generation. I mean, some of those directly, it's clear directly from our experience in COVID that they would be valuable.
I completely agree. I think it's done nothing but help us at FDA focus on what the big important problems are, and a little less about the minutia. So I completely agree with Celia.
I think, following up what Cecilia said about, people were thinking about decentralized trials and things like that, but it's almost as if COVID forced a de-risking, right? You had to do it. So now we have the data of, what happened. And we actually have some data that, if you did it one way before March 2020 and you had to switch to another way, we're now going to be able to compare, did you have any quality? I know our oncology division has sort of asked to sort of flag that. And in our guidance, we flagged, to please identify when you use these sort of different approaches, especially due to COVID, so we can really get a better sense of what did work well and what maybe did not work as well.
Yeah, thank you. We have a few questions that are a little more specific. I've put them into the chat for each of our panelists and can try and get responses back on those to individuals. But I did want to ask one more broad question before we close today. And this relates to real world data and real world evidence. With the focus on real world data and real world evidence coming into play with COVID and with just an emphasis from the agency as well, do you see more guidance from the agency coming forward, more information about how that real world data and real world evidence can be put into play? Are there efforts along those lines?
I'll take this. CDER is coordinating also with CBER on real world evidence and real world data, and we published a framework in 2018 where we highlighted some of our areas for guidance. As I said, we came out with the first guidance on data. There's a number of other guidances on real-world evidence that we've placed onto our guidance agenda, including regulatory considerations and registries and other things. So, you know, there's still progress. I think there's still a little bit of expectations. Real-world evidence will not be for everything. You're going to need, you know, some traditional research. I think the question is, where does it fit well? The other thing is it may evolve as the data evolves, right? So one of the issues with real world data is the data is clinical data. It's not research data. It often doesn't have everything, or it doesn't have the assessments at the time we want. But I think as you start to bring research and clinical practice maybe a little closer, then you'll start to generate sort of the real world data that may feed more into those kind of regulatory decisions.
And the onus is going to be on the sponsors, right, to make sure that that data is validated. It's not like you can just wish it to happen. You have to provide the data. That's not for us to do at FDA. We don't have enough billions of people to do that kind of work. But the sponsors really do have to go dig deep and think very scientifically, just like we would, about, you know, is this really a validated data set that we can trust? And it's a discussion. But without that validation, it's not a discussion. It doesn't work.
Okay, I think I have to close this here because we've hit 2 o'clock. I'm so grateful to each of you. Dr. Corrigan-Curay, Dr. Kelly, Dr. Whitten, appreciate your participation in this meeting. Appreciate our audience. Thank you, everyone. What a great panel. It's been really good. We've gotten a bird's eye view from these FDA experts, and we appreciate that they take this time to be with us today. And we're grateful for their dedication. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon with us. We'll try and get some more answers to you.